Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Jennifer Tobin, and I serve as the Deputy Administrator of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series, which was launched in 2019, highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. A few announcements before we begin the formal webinar presentation. First, this forum is being recorded. The captioned video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website at hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources. So please do go check those out after our meeting today. Next slide, please. In a few moments, I'll turn the controls over to our speaker, but if at any point during the presentation you have a question or comment, please do submit those using the chat function or the Q&A box. I will monitor both of those places and then return to them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And so thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, as well as the Association of State Floodplain Managers, we are so happy to announce that we can offer one contact hour of emergency management training through IAEM or one continuing education credit through ASFPM. However, in order to receive the credit, you are required to attend the entire webinar session today. So if you do fulfill this requirement, you can then please email Katie Murphy at the end of the webinar at hazctr@colorado.edu to request your certificate. And in this email, please do make sure and specify whether you hope to obtain credit from ASFPM or IAEM, because you cannot get both. You can also visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. Next slide, thank you. Now, I'm so honored to get to introduce today's webinar topic and our esteemed speaker. The title of today's webinar is "The Future is Here. New Flood Resilient Building Standards Raise the Bar for Risk Protection." And hopefully this absolutely does that. Nearly every day, like today, if you read the news, some part of our country or world is experiencing record-breaking flood events, such as what we're seeing right now in Libya. Due to climate-driven rising sea levels, storm surges, torrential rainfall, etc., we are experiencing flood events that cause significant damage to property, ecosystems, and loss of life. And as you will hear today, it is clear that the building standards of the past cannot withstand these escalating risk levels. But thankfully, our friends at the American Society of Civil Engineers are taking action. They have recently announced an update to their design standards that will protect buildings from 500-year floods, as opposed to the previous 100-year flood standard. This new standard was informed by the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes, which is a multi-agency federal effort working to incorporate these codes into existing programs that fund or provide technical assistance on construction and rebuilding. As part of this effort, the Federal Emergency Management Agency created a building code strategy. Next slide, please. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming longtime friend of the Natural Hazard Center, John Ingargiola. John is a lead physical scientist in the Building Sciences branch of the Federal Emergency Management, Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. John is a true expert in this space, and we've been honored to have him, as Lori says in the comments, as a three-peat. And you're welcome to go back and see past webinars that John has spoken on twice before. So please do make sure and check those out after this meeting is over to learn more about John's tremendous breadth and depth of knowledge in this space. So today, John will be discussing how the new 500-year flood standard will improve flood resilient design and how these changes interact with the FEMA Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative. Attendees will learn how to access the new standard, the tools to apply it, and ways to stay engaged with the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes. Now, I'm so excited to turn it over to John to begin this conversation. So Katie, please go ahead and share John's slides. And as a reminder to the audience, please do drop your questions into the chat box as John is speaking, or the Q&A box, and I will get to those at the end and have John answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. While we're waiting for the slides to come up, and I think this is a fabulous audience to bring this information, this message, these new standards, the new beginning. If you really want to get right down to it, and I'm excited to tell you what's in there. It's like how the building codes are a cookbook, right, with recipes, and now we have a new recipe for flood resilience. So let's get started on this conversation. I'm really excited. Like in the last 5 years, this is my 24th year at FEMA, and I probably would have told you there's not much happening to advance things like flood resilience. There's grants, there's mitigation, there's local champions. There's a host of best practices, but when does that become the new norm? When does that become the new baseline, the new minimum standard? So I'm excited to kind of give you a glimpse at that. Next slide. And I'm preaching to the choir, but by our own accounts, there's a lot at risk. And FEMA has begun the work to transform risk map into the future of flood risk data. That's very, very exciting for lots of stakeholders and practitioners, especially in the building science and building standards arena. Millions of properties at risk, and annual flood losses doubling per decade. That's 20 billion. And I just read a headline yesterday that here already, September 12th, we've surpassed the total disasters and dollar amount from last year, and we're not even finished with the year. Next slide. But we're having an expanded understanding of flood risk, right? And it's not just what FEMA's data is showing, right? How many of you, looking for a property on Zillow or other platform, and all of a sudden you've got a depiction of flood risk? That's amazing, right? But I read 8 million here. First Street is saying there's 17 million. Once you start to look at non-mapped areas and pluvial areas, and then this is startling. Precipitation models showing that the 1 in 100-year flooding can now be expected every 8 years in some areas. That's truly startling. So what are we going to do about that? Okay, next slide. And read the headlines, see what's happening across the nation. And this is unsustainable to the extent where insurance companies are leaving town or leaving the states. And where does it leave our homes and our businesses and our communities? It's truly concerning. Also changing attitudes towards this. I read another story that looks at, I think it was research by Zillow, that today the younger generation, Gen X and millennials, in addition to when they're looking for a place to live or what type of home, in addition to some of the architectural or ornamental features, they're asking the questions: is this community going to flood? Is my house going to flood? Am I going to be at risk to some climate disaster? So that's the sentiment of the younger generation, and I think together we need to tap into that, and with a little bit of awareness and education, please help spread the word, here and beyond. Maybe we can have a greater acceptance and implementation of these new flood standards. Next slide. So what just happened? Well, first we have to see, well, what do we have? What's in our toolkit right now? If we look at what's in our current building codes and standards. So next slide. So really the Bible for a lot of this is the building standard, the consensus building standard from the American Society of Civil Engineers, in particular ASCE 722. design loads. So that informs the construction design and construction provisions related to seismic, wind, tornado. You see the hazards here, including flood. And that standard, as it's developed and in cycle every 6 years, has to go through a rigorous process, a truly fair, open, and balanced process. I'm not sure everybody knows that or appreciates that. It's done by volunteers, and through that balanced process, you have producers, regulators, consumers. So it's definitely a practitioners, definitely a cross section of the stakeholders that are involved. It's always has to put through that lens. Is it technically feasible? Is it constructible? And is it economically feasible? And the outcome is a standard that when it's incorporated by reference or used otherwise, it leads to safe and reliable structures. Next slide. So how that fits into the process. Some of you know this and do this regularly, and others not as much. But the standard informs and it gets incorporated into the model codes. But it's important, I put the underlines here. The standard is not dictating if and when you decide to build. It's like once those decisions are made, this is how to design and construct the building. And then obviously all of that funnels down, and the authorities having jurisdiction adopt and enforce. Even if it's not through a building code, it could be through a floodplain management ordinance. So it's just important to understand the relationship and how the standards become implemented, incorporated, or otherwise referenced. Next slide. All right, as I mentioned, it's been a long time since we've seen the new and improved, the latest and greatest, the higher standards in these consensus standards. Have to go back to 2006 when freeboard stopped becoming a good idea and it became a minimum requirement across different residential and non-residential buildings. And that went a long way. But why did we have freeboard? And really, wasn't it a proxy for something more rigorous, more comprehensive depiction of flood risk and flood hazard? But due to technology and changing conditions and other uncertainties, freeboard was a good proxy and it's easier to implement. So, but is that freeboard, freeboard for base flood elevation, from 2019, is that going to be the same, 100-year annual exceedance probability in 50 years from now, right? The flood risk is going to change. So very, very quickly, you can see that the assumptions, the percent damage, the annual chance of flood event could increase from 30% to 50% or 60%. Beyond the life of a mortgage, but more broadly across the life of a structure. And so that is real dollars and cents. And so should we still hold on to that concept? Well, let's use the 100-year hazard basis and then let's add a flip. Next slide. Okay, so I think many in this group kind of have an appreciation for all the benefits of freeboard. It provides varying levels of protection, right? If I have a very wide, shallow floodplain, and across that floodplain, impose a 1 foot of freeboard, that might give you quite a lot of protection, even above the 500-year level, right? But what about in the same regard of a very narrow and steep floodplain? And okay, we're going to impose a 1 foot of freeboard, but you hardly scratch the surface there, right? If you're looking for higher protection. So really, something that's more uniform and standardized approach, if the technology is there, if the data, the models support that, is a return period approach. A return period approach provides more consistent protection. And that's actually what the other hazards ascribe to and have been for many, many years, looking at the return periods and recurrence intervals. And as you can imagine, when you're looking at that approach, and if it becomes a higher design levels, all of that flows into not just how high, but all that's required to make that structure actually be flood resistant. And looking at the loads, the resistance, and what to consider in that process. And then, as I mentioned before, just the realization and the knowledge that our buildings are lasting a lot longer. And so we need to take that into account with any future conditions or minimum standards. Next slide. So future conditions is a topic that's that many of us are interested in. A lot of fantastic work going into that space at state and local levels, or amongst research, amongst government institutions. But really, it needs to become the norm versus the models that we have now. And so understanding and be able to apply the impacts from sea level rise and erosion, increased development, changes in precipitation, these really need to be brought to the forefront, and they need to be communicated amongst all of our different stakeholder groups, so that whoever the customer is, the stakeholder, the client, they understand the significance of it and why it's important to include that in future design. You know, there's so many, we have so many issues with the current built environment, right? And there's tremendous investment to either acquire, buy out, or retrofit. But I maintain that you look at the census data, which says 1.5 million housing starts every year, and add to that thousands and thousands of non-residential. We have to stop building the problem. Otherwise, we're just going to be adding to this inventory. Next slide. All right, so why are we here? Why did I gather you together? What just happened? John, tell us what just happened. Okay, next slide. All right, ASCE 722 supplement number 2. It doesn't sound very exciting, but believe me, it is very exciting. So it chapter 5 has always addressed flood loads in the consensus standard, and the committee they didn't just decide to tweak it or strengthen it or otherwise make changes. They decided to rewrite the whole entire chapter. Why? Because that chapter had for decades was always built on the premise we start with the 100-year hazard basis, and we add things like freeboard, we add things like coastal A zones and other higher standards. And you know, the tide and toll of disasters, the real life experience, as well as how the other hazards are dealt with. This committee of volunteers decided we can't do that anymore. We can't, that's a Band-Aid fix. We have to bring flood into the same level of protection and reliability as the seismic standards, as the wind standards. And in order to do that, higher return periods have to be employed. And when that happens, all of those building blocks, I like to call calculation of loads, consideration of combinations, all of the things that are critically important as structures are built and foundations are designed, they have to be reflected in that. Next slide. Okay. A little bit about the ASCE 7 process. Again, the standard has a 6-year cycle, and it's comprised of volunteers that for that 6 years, they work on updating the standard. They come from all walks of life, you know, practitioners, designers, consumers, other groups, including federal agencies, and you're seeing federal agencies, FEMA included, as committee members on some of these standards committees. So it's important to recognize who makes these standards, and then that committee, its work has to be voted on by broader committees and committees based on the entire standard of ASCE and even the public. So all told, the ASCE 722 had to involve about 450 volunteers from those different disciplines, working diligently for 6 years. So I put a lot of faith and a lot of stock in that, and that resonates with me, and helps to answer the question, who makes these standards? Is it a small group of people? Is it open to the public? It is truly open to the public. So just wanted to share that. So what they decided was, let's bring flood in to be consistent with the other hazards. Let's take a risk-informed, risk-based approach, and let's let's have the loads, the newly established loads in ASE 7, then work its way into ASCE 24, which gives you kind of the particulars, the prescriptive requirements that follows the loading criteria. So one of the first things they said is, this cannot apply to the special flood hazard area anymore. This has to apply to the expanded floodplain, 500-year floodplain, where it is established, where it is mapped. The second thing they said is, and again, they made a decision like 6 years ago. So they said, we have to incorporate sea level rise. 6 years ago, we didn't have as many of the new and more rigorous comprehensive tools, the CPCC, nationally applicable information at a granular level. So, but we did have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sea level change calculator, and that gives the relative sea level rise, but that is a default. Sea level rises is required if there's state or local data that's has climate projections. That's what's expected. If not, then it defaults to the Corps of Engineers calculator. So that's what that's talking about, and making sure that we consider the project life cycle and its effect on eroded ground surface. Next slide. Okay, so what does this mean in these risk categories? John, what are you talking about? Higher return periods. And John, we don't have things that we don't have maps that represent, the 750-year mean recurrence interval. What are you talking about, John? So the ASC committee, they explored what is available across the landscape of federal agencies, Corps of Engineers, FEMA, NOAA, USGS. Where have flood studies been done in a comprehensive way, and using models that the estimated MRIs could be calculated if all you're starting with is the 100-year data set. So that's what you see here, risk categories 1 through 4, and 1 is kind of like small, temporary. Risk category 2 is most everything that you're familiar with, including your home and business and commercial. Risk category 3 gets into higher assembly type occupancies and medical, and then risk category 4 is essential and critical. And so for all intents and purposes, 500-year is the new MRI. And what you see here is the scaling factors, and there's an equation down the bottom, and engineers don't like doing equations, but it's important enough that the standard and the committee said, we can't wait. We think that maps and data are coming in the future, but we're gonna provide equation, we're gonna provide these scaling factors, we're gonna document the source in the commentary, and this is how we're gonna estimate from 100-year, the 500, 750, and 1,000-year occurrence intervals. Next slide. Okay, and then this is a depiction, as I said before, it's not just getting to the right elevation, it's look at all of the considerations that have to be taken into account. You need still water flood depth, you need an estimate of the eroded ground surface, you need the delta of the sea level rise. All of that is critical to these calculations of hydrostatic, hydrodynamic, velocity, waves, debris impacts. So this gives in the standard more emphasis to those aspects of appropriate minimum design. Next slide. Here is a link to the Chapter 5 flood supplement number 2. It is free and is available to download or print. And so I encourage you to download it, to read it, to look at the commentary. The commentary is especially informative. It's like, how did they get to the different decisions that are in the new standard? Next slide. Okay, so on the right-hand side, Chapter 5 was just a few pages, and it covered at a very high level design requirements, loads during floods, and some other criteria. On the right, for all of the geeks and nerds, here is the breakdown of the new chapter. With emphasis on the critical loads that are occurring and how to consider them in coastal areas and riverine areas, and what the basis for those loads are and how to consider them in combination and different load cases and reliability, all that geeky stuff. Okay, next slide. So, some visuals that we're putting out there, I took some of these slides from my presentation last week with ASFPM and ASCE, but starting to show, horizontally, this is what this means. The flood hazard area is going from 100 year to 500 year. Next slide. The height at which flood loads have to be considered, the mean recurrence interval increases from 100 to 1,000 based on the risk category. And again, it's establishing the MRI, the height of that for the load determination, flood load determination, and that's going to inform ASCE to prescribe, okay, that means the new design for elevation is 500, 750, 1,000, or something other than that. Okay, next slide. And then, as I mentioned, the relative sea level rise at a minimum has to be considered. Next slide. Okay, as I mentioned, we're seeing growing data set and knowledge base on data for future conditions and climate change. And some of these studies, are showing the trends and the increases in sea level rise in many places across the US. Next slide. So this is just kind of a layout. The big parts of the standard are treatment of the hazard, treatment of the load cases, and reliability provisions that go along with. Next slide. And then here showing you sample text from the standard, very clearly establishing for risk categories 2, 3, and 4, the flood hazard area is the 500-year floodplain. And for this risk category 1, it is what we know as the 100-year floodplain. Next slide. Again, these provisions are right out of the standard, as well as the informative charts and graphs. And it's showing the distinction between still water and design still water, and what makes up the design still water and how it has to be applied through the load standard. Next slide. There again is another representation of that chart, the risk category. Here's language excerpted directly from the standard, that equation explaining what those terms are and the data to use to provide. So the intention there is to, satisfy that gap, fill that gap until such time as we get more robust, comprehensive flood maps and data to be able to point and click to pull up all of the needed data. Next slide. Okay, there's language on the sea level rise aspect that has to be considered for the 50-year period. Again, they're pointing out the distinction historic versus climate projections. Remember, a lot of this got decided, 6 or 7 years ago, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Next slide. Okay, flood load cases. How do you consider moving water, hydrostatic water, waves? Just giving you excerpts directly from the standard. Next. Okay, so I think I've covered the highlights here. In summary, we're turning the corner on the 100-year hazard basis. We're not using that except in just the for small and temporary structures, and we're embracing new higher mean recurrence intervals, sea level rise, and an expanded floodplain. And then this committee, their work finished for the supplement, but I can tell you now that they just started on ASCE 728. Okay, and there's a chapter 5 flood committee, and they're going to review what the past committee did. They're going to look what was the documentation, all the analytical work, and what were they not able to achieve in that cycle. So maybe it's, you know, climate informed sea level rise models. Maybe that's going to emerge in the next standard. So their work just started, and they'll be at it for the next couple of years. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned before, 7 has the loading criteria, and then 24 helps to translate that into things like elevation, into prescriptive requirements for things like openings and flood resistant materials and floodproofing. And so the two work tandem and together. So how, what do we do from here? Next slide. Okay, glad you asked. So this is a timeline showing you across the top the model codes that we have, predominantly the National Building Code. And the 2024 edition is about to come out in a few months. Then every 3 years, you see that 2027, 2030. So as the standards, as the consensus standards develop in their cycles, they are proposed to be incorporated into those model codes. So the IBC 2024 is intended to incorporate by reference, or will incorporate by reference, ASCE 722. However, that standard did not get finished in time to rewrite the flood. So the flood took another year because it was so groundbreaking, so new, and also contentious. Let's just be honest. A big departure, a big new normal, a big change in minimum standard, and so it missed the deadline for the 2024, but it's being prepared for incorporation 2027. And then you see ASC 24 there. The current edition is 2014, and that committee has started its work, and they're on a rapid cycle to update 24, so it reflects all of that new flood supplement. And together, you see those two arrows should inform and be incorporated in the 2027. So those that follow the code cycle and it flows down in your states and communities, once the 2027 codes get published and communities start adopting them, the new standards will be will show up in there. It doesn't have to follow that model exclusively. If your community wants to take advantage of the new standard now, it is written in mandatory language, and it can be considered either in the prevailing building codes or even floodplain management ordinances. I showed here 2028 and 2030. I'll get to that. There's a nice surprise on that coming up. Next slide. So in FEMA's role in this space, you've heard me talk about before. It's like learning from disasters, applying that knowledge, filling in gaps, doing best practices, but little by little, and helping to inform our minimum codes and standards, and that cycle continues. So that takes shape across the various programs. Next slide. Don't want to dismiss the role of other agencies. And so, as I mentioned, the ASCE 7 flood supplement would not have been possible without the extensive studies from the Army Corps of Engineers that contribute to what you see here, the calculation of these loading factors, these scaling factors to approximate the higher MRIs. There's research and data and studies from USGS and NIST and NOAA and FEMA. So it's very much embraces the variety of stakeholders and users of these consensus standards and how they're made up. And the federal government takes an active role. Okay, next slide. All right. So the exciting part for me, if you haven't been exposed to it yet, is I'm one of those engineers, so I need better maps and data if you want me to use these new flood standards. So let's take a peek there. Next slide. All right, and there's some pop-ins here. So take the next slide. The future of flood risk data is really well described in this graphic. You know, going from the binary depiction of flood risk to more of a probabilistic analysis, right? And to do that, we're embracing and harnessing technology advancements, data management, and ways to deliver that. Next button is to serve that to all of you and various stakeholders for the variety of needs to manage development, to consider flood risks, to employ flood risk reduction, and the outcome is a better, more risk-informed approach to flood risk reduction. Okay, next slide. Another great visual is embracing in that technology space. Next slide. You know, moving away from the 1D modeling and its limitations. Next click is to embrace full watershed, full depiction of flood risk, the fluvial contribution, 2D modeling, and what you're able to get out of that with improved precipitation and modeling and more robust data. Next slide. There you go. And be able to plot curves and looking at confidence levels for exceedance and precipitation, just one byproduct of that. Next slide. Okay, so let's look also now at in the digital space, what we traditionally know and use in the regulatory firm and how that's changing. Next click. We're going to be able to look at multiple flood hazard sources in the same analysis. Next click. We'll start to be able to do some comparisons with different outputs, different modeled scenarios, different depth, velocity, duration. Just look at the power that is coming out of the future flood risk data. Look at these scenarios, different probabilities, frequent to extreme. Next click. And then this is exciting for me, connect back to the codes and standards, having two locations and pulling up the hazard data on sites of interest, look at credible valuations. So just imagine be able to pull up or have available flood hazard curves at these locations. Next click. And so at the first click, these two locations, at the 1% annual exceeding probability, they both, line up pretty similar. There's a 1 foot depth. But let's look what happens to the hazard curve. Let's plot the one for B. Next slide. Oh my gosh, look what just happened. So as we consider what I'm dealing with, risk-based, risk-informed, depending upon the type of structure, its use, its occupancy, its importance, those category levels. It's not just residential or non-residential, but look how that hazard curve changes in the location, in the site B location. So very dramatic. This kind of information could not be produced previously, but this is what is very promising about the future flood risk data. Next slide. Other visual products comparisons. This is another kind of draft from their prototypes. I think this is a coastal setting and where storm surge elevation is modeled, and it's relatively consistent, but once you try to model the difference in the waves, then you kind of see a dramatic difference as you plot these curves on the different wave heights. Next slide. So what else is FEMA doing in this space? As the standard is published now, and we want communities to be aware of it, to learn about it, to consider using it. And lots of times FEMA will kind of fill the gap and provide some design guidance. So look for a designer's guide to using ASCE 722 supplement coming out this fall. And it's going to give you the soup to nuts. So it's like, first we're starting in a regulatory framework. You know, here's the current set of parameters in the floodplain. Here's what's new in the minimum load standard, and here are how you here's how you would apply that in your community. Next slide. So I mentioned, like, what does the future look like? And indeed, beyond just the sea level rise, the next edition, ASCE 728, will have an entirely new chapter called Future Conditions. And it's never been done before because until now, everything, the loads, the probabilities, the recurrence intervals are based on historical data, but the Future Conditions chapter will be based on future conditions and climate loads and climate scenarios. And it's going to address flood, snow, rain, ice, and wind, and provide the mandatory language if it's chosen to apply in jurisdictions that adopt it. There's a really good link there to kind of a description of all of this resilient standards and manuals of practice that have come out from ASCE, and describes them and the relevance to that, pathways to resilient communities. Next slide. All right, so this is a busy slide, but this is kind of as a reminder, and I mentioned different federal agencies informing this work, and that initiative continues. We're up to 15 federal agencies now in the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes. Those are the priority focus areas. You can find our first progress report published on FEMA's MITFLAG website. Next slide. And some of the background is here. In addition to the priorities, we have established a task force with subgroups. And every agency, or 9 agencies, have an implementation plan specific to their agency, how they are addressing these key priorities, how they are aligning these modern hazard and climate resilient and energy codes to their programs that fund and finance construction. And there's a nice infographic that you can find also on the MITFLAG website, which starts to tell the story if you're interested in that. Next slide. This is that infographic. So it's truly remarkable. Once we got together and we did a landscape analysis and found that there's 122 programs that fund or finance construction, and that's just from 8 of the majority federal agencies. And you look historically at those funding levels and budget levels, and that's $100 billion available annually to fund construction and $500 billion to finance construction. Well, what did we find about that? And we're seeing all of these investments in resilience and infrastructure, but are those programs and dollars aligned to these latest climate resilient hazard resistant codes? And the first landscape cut said, only 2%. Or it wasn't really specific. It said it'll provide HUD or other agencies providing funds and will say comply with your local codes. But we know that codes are a public process throughout the country. And so what you start with as a model code or standard, what comes out on the other end through amendments and change proposals, you may or may not be hazard resistant at the other end. So the effort here is for those agencies and with their implementation plans to work through their processes, whether it's guidance or policy or regulation, and make it more clear, more specific, the intent to align of all of that with these modern consensus codes and standards. Next slide. And, why does that make a difference? You've heard me and Leslie from Flash, tell the story here. All of these codes and standards are great, but if they sit on this shelf, they don't do much good, right? So we really need to, again, change that needle. We need to partner and equip anyone who wants to work with us, including all of you. And especially now, the administration's focused not just on climate resilience, but on equity and underserved communities. The issue becomes more acute, and through no fault of their own, underserved communities, disadvantaged communities, they may be at a high risk, using the data, the NRIs, the camera tools, high risk, a social vulnerability, and they're in a state or community that doesn't have codes. And so the problem, it becomes, very pronounced in those areas. So trying to get to those areas, looking at the new initiatives and government programs, direct technical assistance, CEDARs. There's a lot of new initiatives that can be advanced. Next slide. All right, a lot of words here, but just to tell you, the national initiative, they had their 1-year anniversary. They met at the White House, and they decided this is what we're going to focus on in year 2. In addition to those implementation plans, more interagency collaboration. I showed you the example with the ASCE, how all those federal agencies, their research, their models, their studies, they were available, they were published, and it helped the standard to go where it is today. So collaboration on that, build up expertise across the federal families. Where are the architects? Where are the engineers? How do we become a little center of excellence for our federal programs? And then do what I'm doing here. Tell people about it. More communications, more partners, more strategic alliances and partnerships to spread the word, and then continue to address research and data, not just the climate resilience, but the growing sentiment that, hey, this is costing too much and it's making things unaffordable. You're pricing out, this is what, there's a steady stream, a steady beat of that, but really do we have to look at at costs in a different light, in a different vein? And so putting some effort behind that is what's envisioned for year 2. Next slide. Okay. Oh gosh. All right. So this is a picture from last week at the NIABC conference, and there's the CEO of ASFPM. Delighted to have him. And there's Dan Cox from the chair of the ASCE Flood Committee. And this went over very well, and we hope to do versions of this as well as webinars, keep spreading the word. And then there's the picture here on the right. This is a convening at the White House Executive Office building. I think this is called the Indian Treaty Room. I'm there on the left side towards the front, but this was a convening with the White House and all those partner agencies to acknowledge the 1-year anniversary and make decisions on the year 2. So that's it. That's what I wanted to share with you. I hope there's some reactions here. I hope there's some excitement or surprise. Really, did that actually happen? And and then that folks are thinking about, well, okay, that's what we've been talking about for years. Different higher standards, different best practices, and changing the consideration of them, not to be, you know, unattainable, but now it's the minimum, it's the floor, if you will. So I thank you for the hosts for the opportunity and to share this information.
Thank you so much, John. That was amazing. And just so everybody knows, we do post the recording of this webinar as well as the slides that John shared on our website. And so you can go back and read all those details that are on the slides, because there was just so much that you covered in that short presentation. But we do have some time for question and answers, and we've already got a couple that are in. But please do, anybody else, if you have questions, please put those in the chat or the Q&A now, and I will try to get to those in our last few minutes together. So first, John, I think that you started to cover this in your presentation, but there's a question from Diane that says, how do we encourage communities to adopt these new standards, especially when you have situations like in North Carolina that have frozen any changes to building codes?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with each and every one of us. We embrace this type of work, but do we embrace it in our own community? Do we embrace it where we live and where we work? Do we know what code or standard that is? Remember, we challenged you all in the last get together, so hopefully you're getting some awareness there. And then, Jennifer, this is a public process across the U.S., so people have to show up. People have to show up, and if these board meetings, code commission meetings, or even legislative meetings had other voices present, I think we'd have a different outcome. Today on the Hill, this is what ASCE presented to staffers about these new flood resilience standards, and they brought up the city of Houston as an example, and following the disasters and the not wanting to go through the same damage and loss and build and repeat again, the bold decisions that they made right since 2017, and forget her name, but she was there from the city of Houston, and she talked about, this is how we did it. We didn't get in a closed room and just decide this. We intentionally had public open meetings inviting all different stakeholders in the community, and she said we had a strong mayor too, right? So it's all the voices of the citizens, the businesses, the government entities, but it's also the elected leaders. It would be great to see many Houston's taking effect across the U.S. So I wish I had, the silver bullet, but it's a multi-pronged approach. And as much as we can educate all of those stakeholders, give consumers a little bit of knowledge, remind elected leaders that, the city of Houston put up their mission statement and their value proposition, and it resonated with everyone in the community, including their elected officials. So they all rallied around that mission and vision for their city. And then that meant that even the detractors, when they went through the process, they came back and said, I don't necessarily agree with everything that you've decided, but I support implementing this for the city, right? So you have to change minds, you have to change attitudes, one community at a time.
Yeah, I'm gonna read John's comment, because I think it's a follow-up to this question, which he says, what about partnering with the National Governors Association, National Association of Counties, National Association of Realtors, the National Municipal League, and League of Cities to get the word out?
Absolutely. Chamber of Commerce, which are the groups that we're not meeting with, or it's just at a high level, how much government dollars are available. Let's start to put this value proposition into those different municipal, state, local government associations, and let's find an association that carries the voice of consumers. Does that exist? imagine how powerful that would be. And again, we could see different outcomes. Thank you for those suggestions.
Yeah. And we have a question from Carson who says, what do you think is the most critical from the research side to help inform future updates of these standards or adoption in communities, either rural or urban?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's amazing what our team members are doing in the risk map space, but it is incredibly complex. And to be able to establish the new risk map, if you will, embracing future flood risk data and all the complexities of that, and how it's dependent upon what the Army Corps of Engineers is producing. It's dependent upon Atlas 15 data from NOAA. And so what's critical for this is to have the collaboration, the partnership, so that what we want to accomplish, what NOAA wants to accomplish, Army Corps of Engineers, and then the practitioner community at large, including ASFPM, that there's focused efforts to get there. And it's not like, well, let's hope that so-and-so has a data set, but really be intentional about that. So great question.
Okay, and Denise asks, how can we address the increase in non-riverine flash flooding from microburst storms? Or Carol Haddock, actually, I think is who's asking the question.
That's great. And I'm not a climate scientist, but NOAA has now established, because they believe in this, a memorandum of understanding with the American Society of Civil Engineers to bring in new data through Atlas 15, through better representation of precipitation and precipitation events. And maybe some of that will be helpful to address those high intensity, low frequency events. But I contend, again, for a broader scale, let's stop building the problem, right? Remember how many new buildings are built. So let's cut the bleeding, if so to speak. And I think advancements in technology and data models can be more predictive and used in response and recovery for those extreme events. I think there was something here about ASC has chapters across the country. And so I want to touch on that because that's absolutely true. And now that there's such a renaissance in flood standards, I've been going to some of the ASE conferences, and some of them are attended by young engineers. And they talk about their work, and I say, that's incredible, but tell me about the building code where you, and they said, oh, I don't know. I work for a client, or well, I'm told to work on these projects, but where I live, I don't know, right? So I think this is a wake-up call, and that everything that is happening at the national level needs to be mimicked across the country. ASCE has chapters, ASFPM has chapters, the international codes have chapters. So really, this is an opportune time for new partnerships, new alliances, and I think that also the multi-pronged approach can help to move the needle.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to go with Mario's question, which is, with the understanding that one cannot put a price tag on human life, who pays for the additional costs associated with these new standards?
Yeah, who pays for the additional costs? Who pays for what we have to do to keep our cars on the road? Who pays for making sure we have batteries in our smoke alarms? We have to take a different view. We have this building code, it's fine, and it's not one and done. There's maintenance, there's applying new technology. All of that does affect the first cost, but again, I contend that let's come up with different ways to speak about all of the costs involved, all of the impacts, all of the effects on post-traumatic distress disorder. There's other non non-financial impacts of disasters. And all of those have meaning, all of those have value. So let's expand the conversation and speak to those issues, because I believe ultimately, and especially our younger generation, they care about the planet. They want to be green. They like conservation. And we have to get them to say, oh yeah, those codes are part of that value proposition, and here's why it's a good investment, and here's how spending the money up front is going to yield that return for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I know we're at time right now, so thank you for this critically important conversation. And like you said, we have to stop building the problem. That's a huge first step in making sure that we're all safer in the future. I also want to make sure we offer gratitude to everyone who is here today. Thank you to all the participants, and thanks again to FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. We're so grateful that you've all joined us today. And as a reminder, please email us. Please email Katie Murphy at hazctr@colorado.edu if you would like to receive a continuing education credit for IAEM or ASFPM. And please make sure to go to the Natural Hazards Center website and sign up for updates so you can receive communication about future webinars and other free resources, including the Natural Hazards Workshop announcements. And finally, we hope that you'll join us next month for our Making Mitigation Work webinar, which is on Tuesday, October 10th, from 11 o'clock to 12 p.m. to 12 o'clock Mountain Time. And on behalf of the entire team at the Natural Hazards Center, we just want to thank you again, John, for your presentation and for all the participants who joined us. And we look forward to seeing you all in October. Thank you. Bye, everyone.